Good evening. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26 is where we will be this evening. Again, I want to take a moment to welcome you and thank you for being here tonight. Sunday evenings are, for me, kind of the hardest. Wednesday night, for me, was actually easier, which may not make sense to some people. But Sunday nights, you get kind of settled in, have a nice lunch during Sunday afternoon, and then you got to turn around and get dressed and come on back. And to me, that was always harder, but it shows your dedication and your faithfulness to God to be here, and your willingness to do what is right, your willingness to worship Him, and your willingness to encourage. And we're grateful for that. There are many among us who are not here this evening, and I think most of them would be here if they had the chance, and we're grateful for those people as well, grateful for them, and pray that they hoping to get better. Let's go ahead and look at Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26, again, kind of kicks us off with Isaac's story a little bit. We have learned a little bit about him in chapters 24 and 25. But of course, Abraham died in chapter 25, and so really now it's Isaac that we're focusing in on, and that's what it does in this chapter. Start reading with me in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 26. Now there was a famine in the land beside the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar, to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So we notice some, I'd say, familiar things that we have seen before in the book of Genesis, things that we've seen before in Abraham's story, and one of which is this famine. You'll note that there's a famine in the land in Genesis 26, and it says, besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So we're reminded of the famine that occurred in Genesis chapter 12 when we had first met Abram. Another familiar element to this story is that Isaac goes to Gerar. Now, Abraham went and dwelt and sojourned in Gerar for a while and dwelt among Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. And so there's that familiar element. And another familiar element is Egypt. Now, in this case, it's God telling Isaac to not go down to Egypt. But in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham went down to Egypt and stayed there for a while there was that famine in the land. And so there are some familiar elements, and we ask ourselves, why are these familiar elements here? I think we'll see in a moment. Now, God also tells Isaac, He says, stay here, don't go down to Egypt. I'm going to establish you here in these lands. I will give you all these lands. And notice the promise that He gives to Isaac in verse 4. He says, verses 3 and 4, He says, I will give you all these lands. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. And will give your descendants all these lands once again. And by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So we've talked about this before, that a way to sum up the promise to Abraham is that he was given a promise about land, a promise about nation, and a promise about his seed or his descendants. That is, he's going to be given a land for his people to dwell in. God is going to make his descendants innumerable as the stars in heaven or the sand on the seashore, and will make a great nation out of them. And by his descendants, or by his seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. We see those elements given to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. And here they are given to Isaac. They are repeated for Isaac's sake here. And so Isaac is going to be part of this inheritance, be part of this promise, if he will do what the Lord has told him to do. Let's keep reading in verse 6. So Isaac lived in Gerar. When the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." For he was afraid to say, "my wife," thinking the men of the place might kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. It came about, when he had been there a long time, that King Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out through a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was caressing his wife Rebekah. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Behold, certainly she is your wife. How then did you say she is my sister?" And Isaac said to him, "Because I said I might die on account of her." Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech charged all the people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." And so we have a familiar story. This happened twice in the time of Abraham. But I want you to notice some differences as we go along the way. Isaac lives in Gerar, where Abimelech is king. And I cannot say whether this is the same Abimelech that Abraham dealt with, or if it is a different Abimelech, being a title of some sort like Pharaoh. There is, I think, evidence in both directions, actually, as you read through the text of what Abraham dealt with and also the text here. There are some evidences in different directions, I would say. But ultimately, Isaac is in the same territory, dealing with the same people, and he commits the same sin that Abraham did, at least the same sin at a glance. But there are some differences. For example, Isaac did not involve Rebekah, whether that was because she refused or whether it was just because he didn't want to involve her. He said, "She is my sister," but in the accounts that we read before, Sarah was willing to say that she was Abraham's sister. She was in on it. We don't see that here. Another thing that we see is that the men are asking about her. He hasn't really planned this ahead of time, but he spouts off, "She is my sister," and he thinks that the people of the place might kill her or kill him on account of Rebekah. So it seems like it's more spur of the moment rather than something planned. But another difference is that Abraham was at least telling a half-truth. That doesn't justify him at all. But Abraham was telling a half-truth. Sarah was his sister, his half-sister, whereas Isaac is, as far as I can tell, flat out lying. Rebekah is his first cousin once removed, not his sister in any way, shape, or form. She is his wife, and only his wife, not his sister as well. And so Isaac perhaps tells even more of a lie than Abraham. So some similarities, but some differences as well. Another difference is that this time, for whatever reason, whether it be because this is the same Abimelech and he learned from Abraham, or whether it be just out of pure coincidence, they don't take Rebekah. Abimelech does not take Rebekah into his house. There is no change in that regard. Isaac gets to keep Rebekah, and she lives with him. And it goes on for a long time, according to verse 8. But Abimelech does eventually find out. In the time past with Abimelech, and in the time where Abraham lied to Pharaoh of Egypt, God intervened and told the rulers that Abraham had lied, that Sarah was Abraham's wife, and warned those rulers. But this time, Abimelech finds out all on his own. He looked out through a window and saw that Isaac was caressing his wife Rebekah, and he could tell by the affection shown that she was not merely his sister. He realized that she is indeed his wife, and he does indeed call him out on that. But once he figures that out, he does set out an edict for the people that they cannot touch Isaac or Rebekah, do any harm to them, otherwise they will be put to death. So Isaac commits a sin that his father had before. And I cannot think that this is merely coincidence. I cannot think that this is merely a case where Isaac committed the same sin without learning it from Abraham, learning that kind of behavior or something like that. I don't think that this is, like I said, merely a coincidence. We'll talk more about that later. Continue reading with me in verse 12. Now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. And the man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy, for he had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him. Now all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stopped up by filling them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are too powerful for us." And Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. So we want to note God blessing Isaac. It says that he sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. Now, full disclosure, a bit of a disclaimer as well, I'm not a farmer. I know nothing about growing crops. However, I have the sense that crops are not supposed to do what they did with Isaac. That they are not supposed to grow 100-fold like that in the same year. I believe that what we're seeing God do for Isaac is blessing him and giving him great bounty. Not just a little bit over the top, but great bounty that he's giving to Isaac. It does say that the Lord blessed him. The man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy. And it talks about his possessions of flocks and herds, and the Philistines envied him. And that leads to a bit of a squabble between Abimelech and Isaac. The Philistines have noted that Isaac is growing and becoming great, and they're afraid of him and envious of him. And so Abimelech the king says, "Go away from us, for you are too powerful for us." I take that to mean that if my army and your servants got in a fight, your servants would win. That's how I take that to mean. And so Isaac is sent away from living in Gerar proper, you could say, and he is now dwelling in the valley of Gerar. Continue reading with me in verse 18. Then Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the same names which his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found there a well of flowing water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with the herdsmen of Isaac, saying, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over it too, so he named it Sitnah. he moved away from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it, so he named it Rehoboth. For he said, "At last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land." Then he went up from there to Beersheba. The Lord appeared to him the same night and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." So he built an altar there and called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. So we're seeing constant contention between Isaac and the people of the land. He's just growing too much and becoming too great, and they're fighting for resources, basically, is what it comes up with. Isaac had dug up the wells that Abraham had made that the Philistines had stopped up, but then he apparently needs more water. Why else would you be digging wells? And so he continues to dig wells, and they run into problems. They dig one well, and the herdsmen of Gerar contended and quarreled, and so they named it Esau, which means contention. And then they dug another well, and they quarreled over it too, so he named it Sitnah, which means enmity. And then he moved away from there and dug another well, and finally he finds a little place that he can call his own, and so he named it Rehoboth, which means room or spaciousness. For he said, "At last the Lord has made room for us, and we will be fruitful in the land." But Isaac has dealt with all of this, and God, for whatever reason, appears to him that same night and says, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." God once again reassures Isaac that he is going to be with him and that he is going to keep true to his promises. Interesting that that happens on the same night that he finds this well, he finds room, he finds spaciousness. So he builds an altar, he calls upon the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there. He's found a place. Keep reading with me in verse 26. Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with his advisor Ahuzzath and Phicol, the commander of his army. Isaac said to them, "Why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you?" They said, "We see plainly that the Lord has been with you." So we said, "Let there now be an oath between us, even between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you, and have done nothing to you but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord." Then he made them a feast, and they ate and drank. In the morning they arose early and exchanged oaths. Then Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. Now it came about on the same day that Isaac's servants came in and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, "We have found water." So he called it Sheba, for therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Gerar the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. So first we want to note that Abimelech has had a little bit of a change of heart. At first he sends Isaac away, but apparently he's been, I think, keeping an eye on Isaac, and he's noticed that even as he's been sent away, that he has been prospering. And he notices, the hand of the Lord is in this. And so he says, let's make a covenant. Let me back up there. Let me make a covenant, an oath between us, even between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you, and have done to you nothing but good, and have sent you away in peace. Now you may argue a little bit with what Abimelech says. He says, we've done nothing to you but good. I could make an argument that they've caused some problems for Isaac, but that may have been the herdsman of Gerar rather than Abimelech, so now we're just parsing words at that point. Overall, though, Abimelech has been good to Isaac. He could have taken Rebekah from him. He could have not made that edict protecting them. So many things could have been different. But Abimelech protected Isaac. And in that, I think we see God's protection, that God was protecting Isaac. And even with this covenant, they see that Isaac is a force to be reckoned with, and they don't want to get on his bad side. And that's why they want to make this covenant. And so God is protecting Isaac and prospering him wherever he goes. Another thing I want to note from this set of verses is we get the city Beersheba, which would be on the southern border of the Israelite territory. And Sheba is what it comes from. This well is called Sheba, and therefore the whole city is called Beersheba. The next thing that I want to talk about is Esau. And for whatever reason, we get this kind of side note at the end of chapter 26 about Esau and his problems. We'll get into talking about Jacob in chapter 27. But it says that Esau married two women, Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. And all you really need to know about them, all we really know about them, is that they were from the territory of Canaan. They were from among the people. They were what Abraham was afraid of Isaac doing, marrying from the daughters of the people of the land. Well, what Abraham prevented Isaac from doing, Esau goes and does of his own accord. Of course, we don't really know what Isaac said, but we do know what it says in verse 35. And they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah are, from what we can see, faithful disciples. Yes, Isaac lied. Yes, he did the same thing as Abraham. But overall, he's a man of faith, and God is blessing him, and God is taking care of him. And these daughters from the nations are not what they would want Esau to find. And so they are grieved over that. And that concludes chapter 26. Now there are two things that I want to leave you with this evening. What we've noted is that Isaac is kind of making his own way, and making your own way can be difficult. Think about when Abraham first comes into the land. It's not too long, and then a famine happens. And then he goes a little bit, and it seems like things are going well, and then he kind of takes a step backwards. And he's moving from one place to another, not really getting settled. It takes a while for Abraham to kind of settle in to the land of Canaan. Well, what Isaac is experiencing in chapter 26 is, I would say, similar growing pains. And he actually ends up committing some of the same mistakes as Abraham. And though they are similar, they are also different in some ways as well. And so we want to note that when it comes to making our own way, and I'm thinking specifically, those who are kids of their parents who are faithful. Byron talked about this, I believe, in an invitation of making your faith your own. Making your own way is difficult, and there are going to be bumps in the road, no matter how far along you are on your journey, whether you're a teenager or whether you're 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old. There are going to be difficulties that you are going to have to overcome. But just as God stepped in twice and reassured Isaac that he was going to be there for him and that he was going to be true to his promises, we have reassurances written in the Scriptures for all time. Anytime we want to access them, those reassurances are there that the Lord cares for us, that He will be there for His people, that He will bless us richly, that we have everlasting life, we have hope. These assurances are what got Isaac through. Those kinds of assurances are what got Isaac through his difficult times. We need to realize that those assurances can get us through our bumps in the road as well. The second thing that I would take from Genesis chapter 26 is, parents, be careful. I've made some points before about parents, but let me make two kind of sub-points here about parenting from this chapter. For one, we see that Isaac picked up on his dad's behavior. Again, I can't see that as coincidence that he does the exact same thing to maybe the exact same person that his father had. I think that was a learned behavior, something that he saw with his father, whether he picked up on that through day-to-day life or whatever the case might be. Now, I could be wrong about that. But at the same time, I think it is a lesson that our kids are watching, and they are liable to repeat the same mistakes that you make if you're not careful. It doesn't mean you have to be perfect, parents. You're not going to be perfect. But what you can do is own up to your mistakes and vehemently warn your children to keep away from those things that you've done yourself. Another thing is, of course, be careful with who your kids are involved with marrying, who they're dating, because we have the end result that Esau marries two women that bring grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Well, parents, I know that your kids, in that dating period, in that marrying period, they will have some measure of independence, as Esau did. But you've got a say in that as well. And you need to make your points very clearly based upon scriptural reasons of why or why not that person is fit to marry your child. And you need to have productive conversations with your children about those kinds of things far before they even think about being married. And so, yes, parents, be careful. I'll close this evening as I normally do, offering an invitation for anyone who may have the inclination to accept. Jesus invites all people from every nation, everywhere, to obey the gospel. For the gospel is the only thing that can save us through Jesus Christ, through His blood. If you have not obeyed the gospel this evening, you have that opportunity. Believing in Jesus Christ, repenting of your sins, confessing His name before men, being buried in the waters of baptism, starting that new life in Christ, living faithfully to the end, you can have that inheritance. Or if you are a Christian, perhaps that you have not been living correctly, maybe you want to make corrections, or maybe you just want to request the prayers of the saints. We'd be happy to help you in any way. Won't you come while we stand and sing?